The day my mother was buried, my stepfather changed the locks. I stood on the front porch of the house I'd grown up in, the house where I'd learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where I'd carved my initials into the oak tree out back. And I watched him through the sidelights as he knelt by the door, screwdriver in hand, like I wasn't even there, like I was a stranger who'd wandered onto the wrong property. I knocked. He didn't answer. I knocked again, harder this time. He finally stood, walked to the door, and opened it exactly 3 inches, just enough to look at me. "Your mother's gone," he said. "This is my house now." I was 23 years old, standing in the cold with a duffel bag and a garbage bag full of whatever I'd managed to grab from my old bedroom before the funeral. I didn't even have a coat that fit. I'd grown 2 inches since the last winter I'd actually lived there. My mother had remarried when I was 16, and her husband, a man named Gerald, had made it quietly, consistently clear that he merely tolerated my existence. Now that she was gone, he didn't have to tolerate anything. "She would have wanted me to have something," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "She had jewelry. A few things from her mother. They should come to me." Gerald smiled. It was the smile of a man who had already spoken to a lawyer. "Everything your mother owned passed to me. That's how marriage works, son." He closed the door. I stood there for a long moment, looking at the wreath my mother had hung last Christmas, still on the door. She'd made it herself from dried magnolia leaves and red ribbon. She'd been so proud of it. I turned and walked back to my truck. How could the woman who used to say I was the best thing she'd ever done leave me standing on the outside of her own front door? I'm not going to pretend I handled the next few weeks gracefully. I slept on my buddy Tanner's couch for 12 nights before his girlfriend made it clear that 3 was a crowd. I worked construction during the day. I'd been doing it since I was 19. Nothing fancy, framing and drywall mostly, and I spent my evenings driving around trying to figure out what my life was supposed to look like now. My mother's name was Lorraine. She'd been a quiet woman, careful with money, careful with words. She grew up in rural Arkansas, the youngest of 4 kids, and she carried that upbringing with her always, a kind of deep practicality, a belief that you didn't say something unless you meant it, and you didn't spend money unless you had it. She'd raised me alone until Gerald came along, working as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company in Decatur, Illinois. We weren't rich, we weren't even close, but we were okay. She got sick fast. That's the thing about pancreatic cancer. By the time you know it's there, it's already had time to settle in like it owns the place. 8 months from diagnosis to the end. I'd driven down every other weekend those last few months, sleeping in her hospital room when they'd let me, holding her hand through the parts she couldn't describe to anyone. Gerald had been pleasant enough during those months, solicitous even. I thought we'd found some kind of truce. The day after the funeral, I understood what that pleasantness had been. He'd been waiting. He'd simply been waiting. I tried to call my mother's older sister, my Aunt Deb. She lived in Memphis and had always been fond of me. She told me she was sorry, that it was a terrible situation, but that legally there wasn't much to be done. I tried to reach out to my mother's old co-workers, people who'd known her before Gerald. Most of them expressed sympathy and nothing else. One woman, a lady named Charlotte, who'd been my mother's closest friend at work for 15 years, paused before she hung up and said, "Honey, I don't know if this means anything, but your mother came to see me about 3 months before she passed. She seemed worried. About you, about what would happen." "What did she say?" I asked. "She said she'd taken care of something, that you'd find it when you needed it." Charlotte paused again. I assumed she meant life insurance, but I'd already checked. My mother's only life insurance policy had Gerald listed as sole beneficiary. She'd changed it when they married, which was standard, and she'd apparently never gotten around to changing it back. I thanked Charlotte and hung up. She'd taken care of something. I turned that over and over in my head for 2 weeks, and it didn't mean a single thing to me. My mother had been meticulous and deliberate her whole life, but she'd also been sick and exhausted and focused on surviving each day. Maybe Charlotte had misunderstood. Maybe it was nothing. Then the envelope arrived. It came to Tanner's address, which meant she had planned this carefully. She'd known I wouldn't be at Gerald's house. She'd thought that far ahead, even through the illness and the pain and everything else. The envelope was standard white, my name written on the front in her handwriting, that familiar, careful cursive she'd spent 30 years perfecting. Inside was a single index card. Nathan, Storage Unit 114, Kellerman Self-Storage, Carbondale. Blue padlock. Combination is the year you were born, plus my birthday month and day. Don't tell Gerald. I love you. Mom, I read it 4 times. Carbondale. She'd gone to college there, briefly, before money ran out and she'd had to come home. That was before my time. I'd never heard her mention keeping anything there. I didn't even know she'd had a storage unit. I pulled up Kellerman Self-Storage on my phone. It was a small place on the south side of Carbondale, about 90 minutes from Decatur. 3 hours round trip. I sat in Tanner's parking lot in my truck and stared at the address for a long time. Why would a woman who never wasted money on anything unnecessary rent a storage unit 2 counties away and never mention it to anyone? I drove down the next morning. Kellerman Self-Storage looked exactly like you'd expect. A long row of orange roll-up doors on either side of a cracked concrete drive, a small office with a hand-painted sign, a single security camera mounted above the entrance that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2009. The kind of place where people put things they don't know what to do with and then forget about for years. The manager, an older guy with a white mustache and no particular interest in conversation, confirmed that Unit 114 was current on payments, auto-paid from an account my mother had set up years ago, apparently. He pointed me down the second row and went back to whatever he'd been watching on a small TV behind the counter. I found Unit 114 near the end of the row. There was the blue padlock, just like she'd said. My hands were steadier than I expected as I entered the combination. 2000 for the year I was born, 0317 for March 17th, her birthday. The lock clicked open. I lifted the door. The unit was maybe 10 feet by 15, not large. On one side, a few plastic storage bins stacked neatly. In the middle, a folding table with a cardboard box on top. On the other side, leaning against the wall in a row, 5 or 6 large envelopes sealed with tape, each one labeled in my mother's handwriting. I walked to the cardboard box first. Inside were things I recognized. A small photo album from my childhood, a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her mother, a pocket watch that had been my grandfather's. Things Gerald had no claim to, things she'd moved here before her illness made that impossible. Just seeing them made my chest ache in a way I hadn't expected. But it was the envelopes that changed everything. The first was labeled Gerald, Property Records. The second, Gerald, Financial Accounts. The third, Gerald, Correspondence with Attorney. The fourth, in slightly heavier print, First National Bank, Joint Account Statements. I sat down on a storage bin and opened the first envelope. What I found inside took me almost an hour to fully understand. My mother had been a bookkeeper for 30 years. She knew how to read financial documents the way most people read a menu, quickly, fluently, spotting exactly what was wrong before she could articulate why. And somewhere in the last 2 years of her life, she had figured out what Gerald had been doing. He'd been moving money, but slowly, quietly, over the course of their marriage, transferring funds from their joint accounts into accounts she didn't know existed, restructuring assets so that they'd be titled in his name alone. By the time she was diagnosed, he had methodically repositioned nearly all of their shared financial life so that her death would leave her with nothing to pass on. But that wasn't the worst of it. The third envelope, Gerald, Correspondence with Attorney, contained printed copies of emails she had intercepted and screenshots she had taken from his laptop when he'd left himself logged in. And in those emails, Gerald and his attorney discussed, in very clear terms, how to ensure that the small piece of property my mother owned outright, a house in Cape Girardeau, Missouri that she'd inherited from her own mother that predated their marriage, that should have been entirely hers, would be transferred out of her name before her death. The property had been transferred, signed over via a power of attorney document while my mother was in the hospital during a particularly bad stretch. A document she had no memory of signing. She'd written it in pencil on a yellow notepad, tucked into the last envelope. I did not sign this. My signature was forged. I believe Gerald obtained a notary stamp from his attorney's office. I have put everything I have here. Nathan, take this to a lawyer. Don't wait. I read that sentence 5 times. I did not sign this. My mother, who never missed a detail in her life, who balanced her checkbook to the penny, who had spent decades reading numbers for a living. She had sat in a hospital bed in one of the worst stretches of her illness and methodically documented everything. She'd been protecting me from inside a diagnosis that was killing her. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and sat there for a minute in that storage unit, not crying exactly, but not okay either. Then I picked up my phone and called a lawyer. I want to be clear about something. I didn't know what I was doing. I was 23, I worked drywall, I had maybe $800 in my checking account. I didn't know anything about property law or power of attorney or estate fraud. I didn't know where to start. What I did know was that my mother had known I wouldn't know. That's why she'd done this. She had organized every document, labeled every envelope, left me an index card with a combination instead of a letter that Gerald might have found. She had done everything she could to hand this to me pre-assembled because she knew me well enough to know that without a clear path, I might freeze. I found a lawyer in Springfield through a referral from a paralegal I met at the courthouse when I went to pull property records. A woman who took one look at what I had and said, very quietly, "You need to talk to someone today." His name was Daniel Whitmore, and he was in his late 40s, the kind of lawyer who had a cluttered desk and a very organized mind and didn't waste your time with pleasantries. I laid everything out in front of him. The envelopes, the printouts, the yellow notepad page in my mother's handwriting. He read through it without speaking. When he finished, he set the notepad down and looked at me. "Where's the original storage unit?" he asked. "Carbondale. You need to go get the original documents today. Don't leave them there. Bring them directly to me." He paused. "Did anyone follow you here?" The question caught me off guard. "What? Your stepfather. Does he know about the storage unit?" "I don't think so. The letter came to a friend's address." Whitmore nodded slowly. "Your mother was careful." He paused again, in a way that told me he was choosing his next words. "The power of attorney filing is dated during a period when, based on these hospital records she included, your mother was on a significant course of sedatives. That's going to be important." I drove back to Carbondale that evening. I want to tell you about the drive, because I think it matters. It was November, already dark by 5, and the highway through central Illinois is flat and straight and goes on forever. I had the radio off. I was thinking about my mother, not about the legal situation, not about Gerald, just about her. About the way she used to make biscuits from scratch every Sunday morning, even when she was tired. About how she'd taught me to balance a checkbook when I was 12 because she said every person should know where their money was. About the way she'd looked the last time I'd seen her awake and alert, about a week before the end. She'd grabbed my hand and held it very tight and said, "I need you to be okay, Nathan." I'd told her I would be. I hadn't known then what she'd already put in place to try to make that true. The storage unit was just as I'd left it. I loaded everything into a large duffel bag. All the envelopes, the photo album, the jewelry, the pocket watch, and drove it back to Springfield and left it with Whitmore's office that night. The paralegal stayed late to accept it. She gave me a receipt. I drove back to Tanner's and sat in the parking lot for a long time. The next 2 months were not simple. I won't pretend the legal process was clean or quick. Whitmore filed to contest the power of attorney transfer on grounds of incapacity and fraud. Gerald hired 2 attorneys. There were depositions. There were moments where I sat in a conference room across a table from Gerald and his lawyers, and Gerald looked at me with an expression of such cold certainty, as if he had already done the math and knew he was going to win, that I genuinely wasn't sure he was wrong. The notary, who had stamped the power of attorney document, turned out to be a woman who had worked in Gerald's attorney's office for 11 years. When Whitmore subpoenaed her records, it emerged that she had notarized the document without being present for my mother's signature. That was the thread that unraveled it. The hospital records confirmed that on the date of the signing, my mother had been administered a sedative strong enough that she would have had significant difficulty understanding and consenting to a legal document. Whitmore brought in a pharmacologist who testified about the specific medication. Gerald's attorney tried to argue the dosage was lower than recorded. The judge, a woman in her 60s who had been on the bench for 23 years, did not appear to find that argument persuasive. Gerald's financial attorney tried a separate tactic, arguing that the joint account transfers had been consensual, that my mother had agreed to the restructuring as a form of estate planning. Whitmore produced the emails. Gerald's attorney asked for a recess. When they came back, the offer on the table had changed considerably. I didn't take the settlement. I want to explain why. I had almost no money, I was exhausted, and Whitmore had gently suggested that a settlement would be the practical choice. But sitting in that hallway during the recess, thinking about my mother writing in pencil on a yellow notepad while she was in a hospital bed, I did not sign this. I couldn't do it. She hadn't done all of that, so I could take a practical settlement. She'd done it so the truth would be in a courtroom. The judge ruled in my favor on the property transfer. The power of attorney was voided. The Cape Girardeau house was returned to my mother's estate, which passed to me as her only heir. The financial transfers were partially reversed, not entirely, because some had been technically legal, if ethically monstrous, but enough that I came out of it with something real. Gerald's attorney was referred to the state bar for investigation regarding the notary issue. I don't know what ultimately came of that, but it was referred. Gerald himself did not face criminal charges. Whitmore explained that prosecuting estate fraud is complicated and slow, and the DA had limited appetite for it. That part still sits wrong with me. I won't pretend otherwise. My mother wrote, I believe my signature was forged, on a notepad in a hospital bed, and the man responsible walked away without a criminal conviction. But he didn't walk away clean. He didn't walk away with her house. The house in Cape Girardeau was a small 2-bedroom on a quiet street about 4 blocks from the Mississippi River. My grandmother had lived there for 30 years, raised 3 kids in it, and left it to my mother when she passed. My mother had rented it out for income. She'd never told me that, either, and the tenant had been there for 6 years and wanted to stay. I drove down to see it on a Saturday in February, the week after the ruling. The tenant, a quiet man in his 50s named Arthur, met me at the door and shook my hand. He'd heard something about the legal situation through the property management company and had been understandably anxious. I told him his lease was good, that I wasn't planning to sell, that I just wanted to see the place. He let me walk through. It was modest and well kept, the kind of house where everything is a little worn but nothing is broken. Small kitchen, 2 small bedrooms, a back porch that looked out over a yard with 1 large silver maple. I stood on that porch for a long time. My grandmother had planted that tree. I hadn't known that either, but Arthur told me he'd heard from a neighbor who'd known her. She'd planted it the year she moved in, back when it had been a sapling she'd gotten from a church sale. It was 40 years old now, easy, big enough to throw real shade. I thought about my mother as a girl, running in that yard under that tree. I thought about her at the end, in a hospital bed, still thinking about me. When Gerald had said, "This is my house now," he'd meant the Decatur house, the one they'd shared. He'd meant the life they'd built together, which I had never really been part of anyway. He had not been talking about this. He hadn't even known this was the thing my mother had been protecting. He'd won the wrong house. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Springfield that spring. I kept working construction. I'm still doing it, actually. The rental income from the Cape Girardeau house is enough to cover my car payment and then some, which is more financial cushion than I've ever had. I'm saving to fix the roof on the house. Arthur told me it's going to need it in the next couple years, and I've been putting a little aside every month. I kept the photo album. I kept my grandmother's jewelry and the pocket watch. I have the yellow notepad page that my mother wrote on, framed now and hanging in my apartment. I did not sign this. I have put everything I have here. Nathan, take this to a lawyer. Don't wait. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry. And the honest answer is, not the way I expected to be. There's a particular kind of anger that burns clean and leaves you empty after, and then there's the other kind, the dull, cold kind that you carry. For a while, I had the cold kind. I'd be at work, running a line of drywall screws, and I'd think about Gerald in that house in Decatur, sitting in the rooms she'd decorated, and something inside me would just go very still and very dark. But the thing I keep coming back to isn't Gerald. It's the index card. It's the storage unit in Carbondale, with the blue padlock, and the combination that spelled out the year I was born, and the day she was born, which no one else on earth would have known. It's the fact that she was sick and frightened and in pain, and she spent some of that limited energy, the most limited resource she had, on envelopes and labels and a cardboard box full of things she needed me to have. She was a bookkeeper. She believed in documentation. She believed if you put something down clearly enough, it would be harder for the world to bury it. She was right. I leave the front door unlocked sometimes, late at night, which is something I never used to do. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because I spent enough time standing on the outside of a door that was supposed to be mine. Maybe because I want the feeling of a place that's open to me, even if there's no particular place that qualifies yet. The Cape Girardeau house isn't mine to live in. My apartment is mine for as long as I pay rent. But there's a house 4 blocks from the Mississippi River with a silver maple in the backyard that my grandmother planted, and it belongs to me, and someday I'll live in it. And when I do, I'll keep the back porch light on. I think she'd have liked that.